and welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast series. I'm Nina Lockwood, founder and director of Intuitive Interim and Executive Search. Throughout this series, I will be sharing engaging conversations with talented leaders from across the UK transport sector.
I'm absolutely delighted to welcome Andy Lord, Commissioner for Transport for London, to this episode of the Intuitive Insights podcast series. If you'd like to hear how Andy got as lucky as he did in his career, then please do come and join us for what I think is an absolutely inspirational conversation. Andy Lord, Transport Commissioner for Transport for London, a very, very warm welcome to the Intuitive Insights podcast. I am so happy that you've been able to find the time in your, what I imagine is an absolutely bonkers diary, to have this conversation with me. Thank you.
Yeah, well, thank you for the invite, Nina. Delighted to be here and follow in so many prestigious footsteps or podcasts ahead of me. So, no, delighted.
Thank you. We certainly have. I'm so proud of the guests that we've had so far. We've had a real eclectic mix of different people with different career stories to tell. And we know that our audience really appreciate hearing your story. We like a good story of kind of how did it all begin? Why transport? Why have you been where you've been? And what have you done? So I'm going to hand over to you and ask you to take me through from the very first part where you decided that's the first job I want to go and do, up until the job you're doing now. And Transport Commissioner for Transport for London, I think it's quite a big job, and I'm quite interested to know what a kind of week in the life looks like. I'm going to hand over to you. Tell us your story.
Thanks, Nina. I guess ultimately, so I got here by accident, certainly as Transport Commissioner, but we can explore that later on, I guess. So how did I end up in transport? I've always been passionate, always had a childhood dream to be a pilot, because I actually come from Derbyshire, and then grew up as a young child on the Isle of Man.
Okay.
So travelled backwards and forwards either by ferry from Liverpool or flying from Manchester. And then obviously the Isle of Man has such a rich transport heritage with the steam railways and the electric railways, and as a young lad was just really interested in all of those. But so I always aspired to be a pilot, and then when I was taking I took my A-levels based on in the 80s. To be a pilot you had to do maths and physics. I wasn't particularly good at either of them, but managed to scrape my way through and get a couple of A-levels in those, plus chemistry. And my single parent family, brought up by my mum, and the careers advisor at school said, well, you should really probably go to university, so you get some qualifications. If you want to be a pilot, that's great, but get some qualifications. So I decided to apply for engineering. And then we all recognised that my mother wouldn't be able to afford to put me through university, so I applied for sponsorship. And this was really the first sort of pathway choice, if you like. So I applied for sponsorship at what was then British Aerospace, Commercial Division, and British Airways, albeit never really had any intention of, if I was fortunate to be offered a sponsorship with British Aerospace, to take it. And that clearly came out in the interview process when I was asked, well, why do you want the job and why do you want to work for us? And I said, well, I don't really. So that sort of led to a fairly short recruitment process. But I filled out the sponsorship for British Airways. And British Airways had two sponsorships at the time. This is in the late 80s, one for being a cadet pilot and one for being sponsored through university to do engineering. Always wanted to be a pilot, but I thought I'd take a bit more time to fill out the application. So I filled out my engineering sponsorship on the Saturday and dated it, and then completed my pilot sponsorship form, which I'd been working on for about 2 weeks, and dated that on the Sunday. And still to this day, having actually then had worked for BA for 26 years, still can't believe they're efficient enough to say, we note you've applied for 2 positions in the company. We can't accept 2 applications, so we've gone with the one that was dated first, which was the engineering sponsorship. so be it.
The universe works in mysterious ways, I would say.
It is. It was a bit of a sliding doors moment to some extent.
Yeah.
And anyway, I was very fortunate. There was about 600 applicants, so not huge compared to the numbers that you see these days. And 19 of us were taken on, and I was one of those, and very fortunate to be sponsored through university by BA, did a mechanical engineering degree and an accelerated apprenticeship. So I did my degree at Manchester Uni. I worked at Manchester Airport in the Christmas and the Easter holidays, and then came down to Heathrow to do my apprenticeship for my whole of my university term, and I absolutely loved it, and it gave me great experience. I loved aeroplanes, I loved aviation. I was, getting hands-on practical experience rather than sitting in a lecture theatre listening to all sorts of very clever people who'd written all sorts of doctorates and theses on engineering that frankly were brilliant people, but it really didn't interest me particularly. I was more interested in getting a spanner in my hand and going working on the airplanes.
Yeah.
And it gave me a real experience of how interacting with different people from different backgrounds. Aviation in the late 80s was quite a tough place, very male dominated. There wasn't a lot of technology, but it was starting to transition from aircraft that were designed in the 50s and 60s to aircraft that were designed in the 80s and 90s, and really moving forward to being more software based industry. Anyway, managed to get my degree, which I'm very proud of. First person in my family to go to university since my grandfather in the early 1900s, and then finished my training with BA in spring 1993. And the graduates, all of us, we had opportunities to go and apply for permanent roles, and I was very, very fortunate. I got a role that was created, and I was sent out to Seattle to work at Boeing as part of a small team of engineers who British Airways were the launch customer for the Boeing 777, which is now a workhorse of long haul aviation. But at the time, it was the latest generation big twin engine aeroplanes, and I was fortunate enough to be sent out there supposedly for 2 years, and worked embedded in with Boeing on the design of the aircraft, seeing how we can make it more maintenance friendly, reduce the weight of it, improve the cost efficiency of it, and as well as take in-service issues on our other fleets to see how they could be designed out on the 777. But after 6 months and having the most amazing time as a 22-year-old, in Northwest Pacific USA, I actually applied for a job and was promoted and came back to BA in London to be a design engineer on a couple of aircraft types, the McDonnell Douglas DC-10 and the ATP, which is a British-built turboprop airplane flying around the Highlands and Islands of Scotland in those days. And those roles progressed. I had design authority, was responsible for the safety and reliability of those fleets. And then I got moved on to Concorde, and I became the lead design engineer for BA's Concorde fleet for all the mechanical and fluid systems. So everything from the drooping nose to the undercarriage to the flying controls to the life support systems, etc., which is still, I would say, still my proudest achievement. Because there's not many people who can say they've held a position like that.
Absolutely not. No, and that's quite something to say. Just by pure coincidence, I was at an event yesterday in Manchester Airport, underneath the wings of Concorde. So they use it as a conference venue now, don't they? The hangar where the plane is, and it's quite something to behold. It's kind of sitting underneath it.
Yeah, so I worked on that very aeroplane, on the whole fleet of 7. And I have to say, despite everything I do in this job and I've done in senior roles, still the most stressful role I've ever had, because we were literally on call, not 24/7 because the fleet didn't fly 24/7, but actually they were so maintenance intensive, and because we were the world leader in supersonic flight. And supersonic aircraft engineering. Concorde flew more supersonic hours than all of the world's air forces put together. And we were doing it with people sitting in civilian clothes without oxygen tanks and drinking champagne. The first time I signed my name
terribly British.
Yeah, exactly. So the first time I put my name to dispatch an aircraft with a new part on board was without doubt that's when I realised the sort of responsibility I held as a design engineer. So and actually, when the very last aeroplane was flown to Filton in Bristol, which is where Alpha Foxtrot is, that was still flight. That went there in late 2003, I think it was, might be in early 2004. I'd finished on the airplane in late 96. That aircraft was still flying under an authorization that I'd given it in 1996.
Right.
So even then, I sighed a bit of a sigh of relief that it was safely down. But so that was so engineering for about 7 years. Then I moved in, took an opportunity to apply for a management role, and I learned quite a lot about this. We went through a redesign of our engineering department at BA in 1996, and it was all about making us less specialist and more broad in our experience and responsibilities.
Right.
And I applied to be a team leader, but I was turned down because I didn't have any what was called then man management experience. People management, people leadership.
Yeah.
And I got really frustrated with my senior manager at the time. I said, well, how am I ever going to get any if you don't appoint me into a role where I will be leading people? So I applied for an opportunity based in Glasgow in our flight operations department. As a bit of a long shot, was working on the fleet of aircraft, the ATPs that I referred to earlier, to work in the flight crew department, flight operations, and I'd been responsible for all the flight procedures for the pilots, safety investigations, working closely with engineering, all the rest of it. And blow me, I only went and got it and was successful. And I said to my then, so Jo, who's now my wife, we got engaged that year, and I said, look, I'm applying for this job. So she moved into my flat and I promptly moved to Glasgow. But I said, don't worry, it'll only be for 18 months or so, and then I'll be back. 6 years later, having basically held a number of roles across the UK regions, I finally came back to London post 9/11. But actually, the reality was I was only away probably a couple of nights a week, so it actually worked really well. But I became a big fish in a small pond, so it was working for a subsidiary of BA called British Airways Regional.
Right.
We flew a lot of flights out of Manchester, Birmingham, and Scotland. And my roles progressed, and ultimately I became chief pilot for BA Regional, and I'm still the only person in BA's history to have held the position of chief pilot without being a pilot.
Well, I was just going to say that to you. How does that work then? Yeah. Because you've not mentioned in any of this, you've not mentioned learning to fly. No. So how do you become a chief pilot if you've not got your wings?
So chief pilot is actually quite an old term. It's equivalent to a general manager, basically.
Okay, right.
And the role is very much around, in this context, people leadership. You clearly have to be technically competent. I'd spent a number of years holding technical roles within the flight operations department. I was based in Manchester. I've been the base manager in Manchester for a number of years. I was highly regarded by the pilots in Manchester because I got things fixed. I sorted things out. I treated them with respect, but I also understood, whilst I couldn't fly an aeroplane, either legally or practically, albeit I've had to go in a simulator a few times and just about managed to get them back down on the runway. It was more around a people leadership role, and I had the respect of the unions and respect of the pilots. And, I was authorised by the Civil Aviation Authority to hold the position. So, I had to prove that I was competent to do so. And that was a real achievement. People can judge on their own as to how successful that model is. The fact that BA have never put anybody in there again since, but the organisation's changed a lot, and equally the opportunity for a ground-based person to do it is not been hasn't come about as much. But there are a number of airlines now that have followed the model, and and it is very much about how you lead people rather than your own technical ability to practically fly. So I held that, and then say 9/11 happened, and that was a big turning point for aviation, obviously.
Absolutely.
Hugely impactful to BA. BA was 6 weeks away from running out of cash. We had to go through a major restructure of the airline, complete retreat from Gatwick. We decided to shut down our operations in the UK regions and franchise it out. So I was brought back to London and put in charge of, I had two roles actually. One was we'd bought a franchise airline in Gatwick called BA City Flyer, and bought that, and we're using that to transition into the UK regions. Right. But I also held the responsibility for leading all our industrial relations with BALPA, the Pilots Union, and all our resource planning. So responsibility for then about 3,500 pilots, and making sure we had them in the right place. I was also responsible for BA's pilot recruitment. So another dubious accolade I have is that I've dismissed more pilots than I recruited in my time as head of pilot recruitment, because we froze all pilot recruitment post 9/11. So unfortunately, there was a few who didn't cut the mustard and had to leave, which is not one of my proudest achievements. But we had to restructure the airline, and BA survived and thrived as a result. And that's when I also got my first experience of crisis management. I was our department's rep in any significant incidents that occurred. And then I was encouraged to apply for my first really senior role as General Manager Operations Control, which is the role basically running our 24/7 ops centre, controlling the airline's flying programme worldwide, and all the crisis management. At that point, typically held by somebody who was doing it as their sort of final role before retirement. And I was appointed after a recruitment process. I was 33 at the time, so I was the youngest person to have done it by about 20 years or more.
I'm just going to stop you there, Andy, if I can. Just press the pause button a tiny minute, because I want to kind of go back to a phrase that you used early on in this story, which was that you were fortunate enough to be chosen to go to Seattle. There's been another bit where it's kind of, highly regarded, and now going into a role a good 20 years. So somebody ordinarily, as you've said, it would have taken them a full career to have built up the knowledge, experience, technical competence to do that role, but you're doing it at your early 30s. So what, and this might be, some people find this a really uncomfortable question, but I'm not going to apologise for it because I'm really interested. What is it about you that gives people the confidence to put you into these really key roles and give you this level of responsibility quite early on in terms of your career story?
Do you know what? It's a question I often ask myself.
Why me?
either blind faith or some very brave decisions. I've been incredibly lucky in my career to have line managers in senior positions who saw something in me and were prepared to take a chance, and were prepared to break the mold in terms of, well, just because that's what we've always done in the airline doesn't mean to say that's the model that's going to work for the future. And they were quite strategic in their vision. They could see that I delivered. I got things done. I did it. I've always worked incredibly collaboratively. I've always been able to engage with people regardless of their background, regardless of their work, regardless of my background. And I've never, ever gone into a role and say, you must do this because I am manager X, or I am manager Y, or I'm a graduate, or I know best because I got a degree in engineering, or whatever it may be. So how you conduct yourself and how you engage with people, I learned from a very early age is really, really important. And that then creates a bit of a groundswell of, actually, that bloke's all right, and he gets things done, and he treats people well, and he's fair, but he doesn't suffer mediocrity. And actually, he's challenging the way we do things to see if there's a better way of doing it. I've also been fortunate in, perhaps I say this in jest sometimes, that I've been fortunate enough in my early career to follow people who were perceived not to be doing quite such a good job, and I was able to come in and do a slightly better job.
Okay.
And then as I got more senior, I was fortunate that I was the first person into a role, so there's nobody to compare me against. So whatever I did was the best.
Yeah, you're setting the bar.
Move on. So, but I'm passionate about what I do, Nina. I had a love for aviation. I have a real love for TfL and public transport, and I love the fact that we're delivering for customers, and in our case now, delivering for London. So yeah, I have generally been fortunate in terms of people who've been prepared to take a chance, and I now. In fact, I would say for the last 10 or 15 years in my career, when I have been in senior roles, that's exactly what I've done in people. If I've seen something that I think actually they've got real potential, I'm prepared to take a chance on them. You've got to make sure they've got the right support around them so they're set up for success. And I've been lucky that that's happened. And being inquisitive, I've never just done what I've been asked to do. I've always thought about, well, is there an opportunity to do even more or make it even better? I've never been a 9 to 5, just stick to my job description type. And my wife and my kids would probably say, and that's probably led to me being at work more than I should have been at times. But I think having a really strong work ethic, but treating people with respect and treating them fairly throughout my career has led me in really good stead.
Yeah. I think what you've just done in the last 3 or 4 minutes in terms of that explanation is kind of career 101. If anyone's listening to this in terms of, right, how do I get up the ladder? How do I progress through my career into a senior role where I'm responsible for, lots of people and making things happen? You've just given them a tick list of things to focus on. And I think so often historically, it's been around, certainly, my background in banking, it was about going from, you're a grade 1 and you need to get to a grade 5 in your clerical, then you move into your kind of your management level, and then you move, and it's kind of like, well, that's not what we focus on actually anymore in terms of that whole kind of stakeholder engagement piece that you've talked about, being trusted to deliver. Looking for opportunities to do a little bit more. And we're not saying you've got to work 20-hour days and knock yourself out and burn yourself out, but how can I use my initiative? How can I do a little bit more than you expected of me? You've given us a brilliant tick list there, focus list to say, in terms of building my career in any industry sector, actually, what do I need to be doing in terms of my personal characteristics and my work ethic over and above the technical competence that I'm bringing to the role. So thank you. That's brilliant. Thank you.
No, pleasure. And I think, 2 or 3 other very quick points. I've never had a career plan.
Right. I was going to ask you that actually. No. Right.
Even when I was coming out of my training at BA and the training manager said, you need to have a 5-year career plan, I said, I don't know what I want to do in 5 years. And none of us know what this airline will be like in 5 years. And I can tell you it was a hell of a lot different 5 years after I finished my training than it was when I finished my training. I only ever had 2 career goals. One was to be a pilot. Well, failed at that one. And second was to try and be a senior manager grade in BA by the age of 30. I achieved that at 30. And that was purely driven by not being a grade thing, but just around time in my life with being married, young family, all the rest of it. But my number one piece of advice, and I say this, I was doing introductory talk to all our graduates, apprentices and interns who started at TfL a couple of weeks ago. The biggest thing you've got to do when you come to work is you've got to want to get out of bed in the morning to come to work. Too many people go to work because they feel they have to, not because they want to. And I've been incredibly lucky that pretty well every job I've done, I've thoroughly enjoyed, and it's made me excited to get out of bed in the morning.
completely agree with you on that one. And I've definitely done both. But I came across a phrase a few months ago now, but it just keeps coming back to me literally every single day. If you're not changing it, you're choosing it. So if you're waking up in the morning and the alarm's going off and it's like, I really don't want to get out of bed. And that's happening every single day of the week, because we all have the odd day, don't we, where we think, do you know what? Shall we not and say we did? It's kind of like that. If that's a perpetual feeling when the alarm goes off, you need to change it. And I know it's not that easy, but I absolutely accept your point. You've got to enjoy it. You've got to enjoy what you do, and that passion. I've never, ever, in any industry sector I've worked in, I've never met people who are as passionate as they are in the transport industry.
No,
ever.
Totally.
So where do we go next then? After this, after coming into this role as the general manager of control early on,
So did that for a couple of years. Restructured how we ran it. Became much more customer focused. Became responsible for BA's crisis management, which I did. So did that from 2004 until I left in 2015. So that's when I lost my hair. Because BA had a few crises to deal with, and some of those could make a whole podcast series on their own. So I dealt with everything from severe weather, Terminal 5 opening, the A38 crash at Heathrow, the Litvinenko poisoning, major IT failures, ATC system failures, you name it. But learned an incredible amount throughout it, and actually we set up the first ever, believe the first ever business resilience department in a FTSE 100 in the UK, because we took emergency planning to the next level and turned it into proper business resilience. So by the end, we were responsible for everything from how would BA react in the event that it did, worst case, God forbid, have an aircraft accident with fatalities, through to making sure we could cope if the Treasury dealing system went down or the website went down or anything like that. So learned a lot of that. My roles then, there were various restructures in BA. My roles grew. So then I became head of operational planning and control. That's the role I was in when both the BA 38 crashed Heathrow in January 2007. And then two months later, Terminal 5 opened. So I was sitting in the chair of our crisis centre and the one making the decisions about cancelling flights on the day Terminal 5 opened. And that was quite a moment in time for BA. But we got through it. We handled it well. We actually fixed the issues very quickly with colleagues from Heathrow. And then that was also, of course, when the economic crash happened. So not 2007, 2008, economic crash happened. And BA's revenue fell by £1 billion in the space of 6 months. So again, we had to restructure. At the time, Willie Walsh, who was our chief executive, and I was on the executive as an interim director, we made the really novel but brave decision to allow any manager in the company to leave on a severance term, regardless of what role they were doing, what experience they had, how good or bad they were. And everybody could go, but they all had to make a decision to go by the end of December that year. And anybody who chose to stay could absolutely stay, but they were not guaranteed a role. So there was still a risk that they could be made redundant afterwards, because we were going to redesign the organisation based on what the organisation needed, not based on the people we had. I chose to stay. I was made permanently Director of Operations, so looking after BA's operations at Heathrow, Ops Control, various other things. And then that developed. We merged with Iberia to form International Airlines Group. Keith Williams, who you'll know, as in Williams Review, who was CFO, became CEO. He asked me to take on a greater responsibility. So then I took on responsibility for BA's worldwide airport operations and what we call user charges. So I had about 9,000 people, £2 billion cost base, and direct control of all of BA's operations. We then bought British Midland Airways, so we led that merger and integration at operational level. We were a big sponsor for the Olympics, so we had to deal with all of that as well, which was a great occasion. and we delivered with the first and only exco in BA's history to develop our own business plan and deliver it a year early. So we dealt through the economic crash, the banking crash, and grew our revenues, grew our brand reputation, and all the rest of it. We then restructured again, and it was at that point where I kind of decided it was time for me to move on. I was being BA's ops director for 7 years.
Right.
I think I'm still the longest serving ops director in BA's history. But I could start to feel it was a time for me to probably move on. I was starting to be, although I was only 44, I started to feel I was now one of the old laggards who was starting to say no to some of the younger people coming in. It was taking its toll on work-life balance, and came to agreement there was no natural successor for me because the role had sort of grown around me. So we agreed that I would help with the restructure operations, and then I left on good terms with the airline in May 15. And I had the most fantastic 26 years at BA. I'm still very proud of BA. It's had some challenges since, but very proud of what we did. And I was also very lucky during that time. I was appointed to the board of NATS, National Air Traffic Services, as the BA rep. So I was on the board there for 8 years and chaired their Remco and did various things with them, and also sat on the board of City Flyer Express. So out of the remnants of the airline that moved to the UK regions, we set up a new airline called BA City Flyer at London City Airport, and then sat on the board of that for 4 years, which built the corporate strategy for that and the refleeting program. So that airline is now the biggest airline operating at London City under the BA brand, and has proved to be extremely successful. So I left BA in spring 15, did a little bit of consultancy, still carried on the NATS board on behalf of BA for another year, and then was approached to join Menzies Aviation, part of the John Menzies PLC, as Executive Vice President for UK, Europe, Middle East, Africa and India. So running the P&L for that region, running the operations, the safety responsibility. That was about 15,000 colleagues across, I can't remember exactly how many countries, but about 20 countries.
Wow.
And over the 2.5 years I was there, we doubled the profit, improved the safety, improved the customer satisfaction, and did some really great stuff, opened some new businesses. But then, we had a separating of our ways between me and the chief exec on strategic direction. So I left. Probably the biggest favour anybody did for me actually was sort of forcing me out of aviation in sort of spring 19. I was approached by TfL, see if I was interested in being managing director of LU, and my wife often says, you always said the only place you would consider going to outside of aviation would be the underground, because of I just think it's the most amazing organisation and does great things for the city, and interested in the engineering that side of it. And I was very lucky that Mike Brown, who was the then commissioner, he and I had worked closely together when he was COO at Heathrow for a couple of years. So we knew each other, went through a process. I was lucky enough to be awarded or be offered the role, and started in November 19, so just 4 months before the pandemic, running the tube, and then taking on the responsibility for the operational readiness for the Elizabeth line. So that was a big move from aviation into public transport and the rail sector, with no rail knowledge whatsoever except as a customer, or the T5 transit between the main terminal there and the satellites. But really exciting opportunity, some great people. And then, of course, the pandemic struck. And it was sort of the natural thing that myself, with my operational knowledge and my crisis management background, along with Gareth Powell, who was then managing director of surface transport, subsequently left TfL, is now running Stansted Airport, that he and I were the two executives charged under Mike to basically run the whole of TfL's operations during the pandemic, making sure we could keep our services running, how we dealt with the ever-changing requirements of lockdown and regulations and social distancing and all the rest of it. Put a whole structure in place around governing that. Put a whole structure in place along with other colleagues around engaging with our trade unions and our colleagues to make sure we did everything possible to put them at the heart of our decision making. And I'm incredibly, that was without doubt the hardest I've ever had to work. We were doing, Gareth and I were doing 16, 18-hour days, 7 days a week for about 4.5 months, I think, to get through that. And then, of course, the consequence of that is our revenue and passenger numbers fell by about 95%. So then we had to go to government and talk to them about funding. And, there's much documented about the fun and games we had with that. Absolutely. But learned a huge amount about politics with a big P, dealing with both central government and local government, City Hall. We had incredible support from the Deputy Mayor at the time, Heidi Alexander, and also Sadiq. And I think they could see that TfL was in safe hands under Mike's leadership, mine and Gareth running the day-to-day. And I'm still incredibly proud of what we achieved during that time. We kept all the lines running, and we were carrying 100,000 NHS workers a day on the tube and on the bus network. And if we hadn't done that, the implications are just not worth thinking about.
Absolutely huge.
Learned a huge amount. And then Mike announced he was leaving. Andy Byford then joined, and which was great. And then we got the longer term agreement. We got the Elizabeth line open, which is just the most amazing railway in the world. And then Andy announced he was going, and quite suddenly, quite surprisingly. And I was asked if I would step into the interim position. I'd always said I'd never wanted to be commissioner. It was far too political a role. Why would I want to do that? And when I went home to tell Jo, my wife, that I'd been asked to do it, she said, "There's no way you're doing that role. You've said you will never do that role." And we literally didn't speak for about 3 days because she was so angry with me, because she was really worried about the impact it was going to have.
Understandably.
But we talked it through, and it was kind of a sort of try before you buy on both sides. So it was agreed I'd do it for at least a year, depending on what happens with the recruitment. And then obviously, I actually have thoroughly enjoyed it from day one. TfL is the most amazing organisation, the largest integrated public transport authority in the world. Our people do the most incredible things day in, day out. And I'm hugely honoured and privileged to now be doing the role on a permanent basis. I'm really, really excited about what the future holds. And I would encourage anybody who's listening to this podcast, if you want a role in transport, there is nowhere better than TfL to come and have a career or come and experience it. It's just a brilliant organisation, and we're going to make it even better.
Fantastic. A rallying cry. I love it. Even bearing in mind what you said about the role that you're doing, that there's politics with a big P. I had no idea, until nearly 11 years ago, when I started working with the transport industry. I had no clue before that how influenced the industry is by political decisions. And we're seeing that a lot at the moment, aren't we? And we have been over the last 3 years significantly, I guess, since the pandemic. But I think that the point that you make there around carrying the NHS workers, this is one of the things that I wish as an industry, as a whole industry, we would get better at, in terms of letting the general public know very, very clearly what social value the transport industry provides, because we hear lots around how much the transport industry costs the taxpayer, but we're not really hearing very much about the value that it adds to the economy and getting people where they need to be. And that example you've shared there with the NHS workers is a cracking one, because nobody would have been able to get to work. 100,000 people wouldn't have been able to get to work if you hadn't kept the tube running and the buses running in London. So, oh my word, I could get on my soapbox there, but I won't, because this is your podcast, not mine. We're going to move on, Andy. Thank you so much. There's so much in there. So much to learn. Certainly not from my perspective. You haven't. I could carry on listening to you for hours, quite honestly. I'm going to give you 3 wishes. This is where I get my magic wand out and I say to you, if you could have anything, if you could change anything, transform anything within the transport industry to make it better, what 3 things would you choose?
Wow. So in no particular order. Coming from the background I have in aviation, I've worked with trade union colleagues for many, many, many years, and I've made it my priority when I joined LU and now as TfL to make sure I have a good and open relationship with senior officials in the trade unions, and I do, along with Fiona Brunskill, who's my Chief People Officer. The 2 of us have a very good, honest, open relationship with trade unions. The first wish I would have is that we could just work collaboratively together, management and trade unions across the industry, to do the right thing for the members and the staff in the railways and the transport industry, but to deliver for our customers as well, and not default to every time management table something, the answer is no, we're going to go on strike. And that's a huge generalization. And there are many, many brilliant trade union representatives across our industry. But the learned behavior, probably driven by some of the politics, is whatever management come up with, the answer is no. And actually, my biggest request is that I just want the trade unions to represent the majority of their members' views, and work with us so that we can deliver real job security and certainty for colleagues across the industry. TfL is slightly different to the rail sector, but the principles are the same. And it would just transform our industry, it would transform our financial situation, it would transform morale, and it would transform the reputation quite quickly. So that would be number 1. Slightly controversial, particularly to some colleagues who might be listening, but I generally think we could work together and we could solve so much.
I agree.
The second one would be, and this is TfL specific, to really agree and have a long-term capital funding settlement so that we can continue to invest in the new rolling stock, the new signalling, the road infrastructure that we need to continue to drive London forward. We made real progress, seeing the benefits on the Elizabeth line, seeing the benefits on the Northern Line extension, Barking Riverside extension, new trains under test in Germany now for the Piccadilly line, which will be transformational, new trains under test for the DLR. But the Bakerloo line trains are nearly as old as I am. They're the oldest trains running in public service in the country, and we still don't know if we'll have the funding to replace them. We have the most brilliant team of engineers and maintainers, but it's just not good enough to be running trains that are 51 years old and are probably going to be in service for at least another 10 years. So that would be the second wish.
And I think, to be fair, that whilst you say it is definitely TfL specific, I think there will be lots of people from the rail and the bus industry listening to this who are saying, actually, we'd like a bit of that long-term certainty as well, so that we can, make the investment. And, we're seeing some of that, aren't we, with Avanti got their 9-year contract agreed last week. So it's kind of, we're seeing some of that, but I think we could see a bit more of it.
No, definitely. The third wish is really quite a tricky one. I think it would be more around how we help transform our industry to be much fairer, greater equity, and more diverse. We have, again, TfL, we have incredible diversity amongst our operational colleagues, gender, ethnicity, faith, sexuality, whatever it may be. But we're not doing enough as an industry to encourage people to join it. We're certainly not doing enough to encourage people to go into STEM careers. And we are collectively, unfortunately, too many of us in senior positions look like me and talk like me. And, you know, as a middle-aged white bloke, you know, there's many of us who are good, but we have got to make sure as senior leaders, we are pulling through the organisations and through our organisations the hidden talent or the not so hidden talent, to make sure that we're really driving that diversity of thought for the future. So that, you know, there are people in their late 20s, early 30s who get the same opportunity that I did, you know, 20 years ago. And then how do we do that cross industry? Because again, we're quite siloed in what we do. TfL rarely gets talked about in the context of the rail sector. Yet we carry more rail passengers than any other, than the whole lot put together. So how we do greater collaboration across, and we are getting better at that. But I think, you know, I'd love to be looking back from wherever I might be in 10 years' time and say, look, there's the legacy. We've got a really diverse senior leadership in TfL who are really making a difference and doing a far better job than I did when I was running the organisation.
We've got heated agreement from me on that one. Absolutely. And it's something which we're definitely banging a drum about in my business, and kind of doing what we can do to support our clients with their diversity in terms of the shortlist that we provide them. I think the fact that you've got that level of awareness, and also that you've quite clearly got that passion to pay it forward, because you recognise, you've used the word lucky so many times during this conversation in terms of you've been lucky in your career, but what you're recognising is that you've been given opportunities, you've been recognised for the potential that you had, not just for what you've already done, and being able to see all of that and then pay that forward into your own colleagues that you're working with at TfL, whether that's at kind of senior, middle and operational level. I think that's a really good starting point, Andy.
Thank you.
So final bit before I let you go. What gets you out of bed in the morning? What motivates you? So if you're kind of feeling a bit like, need a bit of inspiration, need a bit of get up and go, where do you go for that? What's your source of inspiration?
Well, as I said earlier, I genuinely love my job, and really feel that I am making a difference, and I'm inspired by what we do and what our people in TfL do. I'm very lucky. I have a wonderful family. My three kids are grown up now. They're all either just finished uni or just started uni or in between. So doing what I can to support them is a big motivator. I'm also a passionate rugby fan, ex-rugby player. So hoping amongst hope that England will do well in the Rugby World Cup is a key motivator at the moment. But no, it's genuinely around. I work with some really fantastic colleagues. You know, my team, some of whom you've just met this afternoon. I generally want to come to work to see the colleagues I work with. I generally want to go out on the network and see our customers and talk to our frontline colleagues. You know, I say it a lot deliberately because we are just so incredibly lucky that we have 27,000 direct colleagues who do the most amazing things 24/7, day in, day out across our organisation, and then up to about 80,000 others doing it on TfL's behalf. And without them, this city would not be moving. There would be nobody who would be able to do business. Nobody would be going to hospital appointments. The economy would not be growing. And I've never really had that sort of social purpose before, because I worked in the private sector. I was, passionate about aeroplanes and love going to the airport. But now it's around actually you genuinely feel you're making it, that we are making a difference.
Absolutely.
And that's a big motivator in the morning.
Yeah, fantastic. Andy Lord, Transport Commissioner, I have thoroughly enjoyed this conversation. I'm so grateful to you for making the time. And I'm 100% confident that our Intuitive Insights audience are going to really enjoy it too. So thank you.
It's a real pleasure, Nina. Thank you for asking me. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you.
My huge thanks to Andy for a really fascinating and inspiring conversation. My cheeks were aching from smiling at the end of this one, and it was a Friday afternoon when we recorded, and it lifted my energy just in time for the weekend. Absolutely spot on. Thank you, Andy.